Last night, yesterday afternoon, Dana and I were in Nashville, and we did what we have done a bunch of different times. We went to Centennial Park, where the Parthenon is, and we walked around. And we noticed a couple of things yesterday afternoon. We parked, we started walking around, and there were food trucks. But they were there for an event, Shakespeare in the Park. Hoity-toity. Shakespeare in the Park was at Centennial, and what are they doing? Midsummer's Night's Dream. I know, right? Okay. Yeah. So Shakespeare in the Park was in the park last night, and we did not pay for tickets, so we walked around the outside, and we did not see Midsummer's Night's Dream or whatever it was. We were on the other side of the curtain, so to speak. But as we're walking around over at the corner of the Parthenon, there was a street preacher. Are you familiar with street preachers? All right. There are degrees of street preachers. There's the yelling, screaming, sweating, slobbering street preacher. And every fourth word is hell. And then there's the pretty chill street preacher. He's preaching, he's wanting to convey his message about Jesus, but just a tad more chill. And this guy yesterday was more over on this end. And I too am a preacher. I didn't stop and listen to him. We just kept walking. I don't know exactly what that says about me or about his preaching or whatever, but we were just walking. I smiled at the guy and I just kept walking. Mainly, I ignored him. In the book of Mark, in Mark's gospel, I used to call Mark the Schwarzenegger gospel because it's short, it's action-packed. They're going from here and doing the thing and doing the next thing and going here and doing the thing and doing the thing. All right, it moves a lot. Now, kids these days don't know Schwarzenegger. I weep for the future. So I don't know who the latest action hero is, but Mark is kind of like that. And Mark, in Mark's gospel, early in Mark's gospel especially, people react and respond to Jesus in a bunch of different ways. Their response to Jesus is tremendously different. In the third chapter of Mark, Jesus' own family tries to go and get him because Jesus' family thinks he's crazy. We're 3 chapters in. Jesus' family, I'm assuming it's his brothers, maybe some aunts and uncles in there somewhere. But Jesus' family thinks he's crazy and they're going to get him and bring him home and take him to therapy or something. Earlier in chapter 3, the Jewish establishment, the religious people, they're threatened by Jesus and they start to plot to stop him and to kill him. Now, those are very drastic. There's a difference between, Jesus, why don't you come home with us? We've got a nice padded room for you. And we've got to stop this guy and we got to kill him dead. In chapter 5, Jesus heals a demon-possessed man, and the demons go into a bunch of pigs, and the pigs jump off the cliff, and the whole city gets together and kicks him out of town. I don't know where you're going to go, but you can't stay here. Leave. At the end of chapter 5, we're going to look at some stories from chapter 5 today, so if you want to find Mark chapter 5. At the end of this story, we're not even going to read it, people laugh at Jesus. In chapter 6, Jesus goes to his hometown. You would think if you go to your hometown, that's your people. They didn't believe in him. The people in his hometown who had seen him grow up, who knew his family, they didn't even believe in him. So kind of like the street preacher last night, people respond very differently. Just a very, very few times I've, finger quotes, had to be a street preacher. That's not my thing. I don't enjoy that. Dana and I were young married. I went on a trip with some of the men from our church. It was the night before the Indianapolis 500 in Indianapolis. Shocker. It was the night before the Indianapolis 500, and there's this huge street festival. It's like a big, state fair. Hundreds of people, thousands of people mulling around. And this group of Christian guys from the church that Dana and I started going to, they thought, yeah, let's go there and tell them about Jesus. So I got on a bus. I didn't know what I was signing up for. I got on a bus with some other men from our church, with some of my teenagers, and then I was told, once I was in Indianapolis, yeah, you get 5 minutes to preach with this microphone and this speaker. I was not a trained preacher. I didn't know which end was up, and I was terrified. A few years later, after I'd been in ministry for a while and I was a little bit more used to preaching and teaching, I got an opportunity to do that in Trinidad on a mission trip, but at least I knew about it then. They didn't even call it street preaching. They called it an open air service. Meaning they went on a corner of a big residential area. They had a microphone and some speakers and a few guitars, and then we preached. Never mind if anybody in the surrounding houses wanted to hear it or not, they heard it. But especially that night in Indianapolis, I was young in ministry, very, very, very young in my ministry, probably still very, very young and immature in my faith. And all of a sudden, I am street preaching on some corner, surrounding by many people who had been several hours into the adult beverage phase of the night before the Indianapolis 500. And like the street preacher at Centennial last night, some people just walked on by. They completely ignored me. Some people stopped long enough to hear what I was saying and then just took off. Some people probably smirked and laughed a little bit. A few people hurled insults my way. But one guy walked past me close enough to where he wasn't even speaking very loudly. But he walked past me, and almost under his breath, he said something so foul. And it wasn't about me, it was about Jesus. He said, he didn't insult me. He said what he said, insulting Jesus. And I thought, if God really does hurl lightning bolts down from heaven, I want to get out of this guy's way because they're coming. People came in the Gospel of Mark very differently. Some people didn't believe, some people believed, some people flocked to him, some people didn't care, some people asked him to leave, some people thought he was crazy. That's the world we live in today. We're going to meet two people here in Mark chapter 5 that came to Jesus in the same posture. And here's the word, they were desperate. So that word desperate, I want you to wrap your emotions around this scene this morning. If you'd like to, you can stand up in honor of God's word. We're going to read just a few verses from the 5th chapter of Mark's gospel. We're starting in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, see, there was the Jewish side of the lake and the Gentile side of the lake, the Samaritan side of the lake. He's back over with the Jews, with his people. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. And one of the synagogue leaders, a man named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, Jairus fell at Jesus' feet. He pleaded earnestly. You picking up with those two words? He didn't say, hey, Jesus, if you've got time, you'd be really doing me a solid. He pleaded earnestly with Jesus. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. He's desperate. He's desperate for his daughter. So what does Jesus do? So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Picture hundreds of people jostling. They're going through a crowded. I picture Jairus grabbing Jesus by the robe and saying, please, please, please hurry. My daughter is sick. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been the subject of bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his cloak, thinking, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. We'll come back and finish in a minute, but this is a word from God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You can sit down. So a couple of things. Man, I hate to bring this up, but suffering is a part of life. So it's either you're suffering or you're suffering because somebody else is suffering. Jairus is suffering because his daughter is suffering, and this woman is suffering because she's got a physical malady, but this isn't just physical. See, we read this story. This woman has an issue of blood for 12 years and she can't be healed. And she tries to find ways to be healed. She goes to this doctor, and then she goes to the next town, and she goes to a different town, and she hears tell of a wise woman that lives outside of town. She goes there and she saves up her money, and she gives them the money for some elixir, some concoction that might heal her, because it's not just physical. In this Jewish society, anybody who had blood on them was unclean. Blood was unclean. Now that's important because if you're unclean, you can't go to church. And if you don't go to church, you can't make your sacrifices, you can't pray the prayers. You're separated from God. So for this woman, it's not just I have this issue where I bleed. It's not just a blood issue. It's a separation and an unclean thing. She is literally unclean. And the way clean and unclean worked back then was, if I'm unclean and I bump into Robin, Robin's unclean. And then anybody who bumps into Robin, Tom bumps into Robin, accidentally shakes Robin's hand. Robin's unclean. He goes home and he shares that with everybody else. Suffering makes you desperate. And he had to get to Jesus. Jairus' daughter is sick and dying, and he thinks, I've got to get to Jesus. So in a crowd where everybody's clamoring for Jesus' attention, everybody's calling out to Jesus, he makes his way to Jesus. I just picture him. He falls down and he pleads intensely, my daughter is dying. Will you please come and help her so that she can be healed and be well? And Jesus goes. See, desperation makes you do things. If I found out, before, you think that people come and play drums and play the guitar. You think Aaron plays the guitar on Sunday morning just because he loves Jesus? No. Joe gives him donuts. Did you know that? Joe would love to bribe you too with donuts. Joe goes every Sunday morning and he gets donuts from Krispy Kreme. And so when the band comes together, he sugars them up with donuts. If I knew now that there were extra donuts in Joe's office, I would be interested. But have you ever had 5 daughters' donuts? 5 daughters don't. See, now you're listening, aren't you? Not boo from this section until I said 5 daughters donuts and I heard, what? So 5 daughters donuts, there's several locations in Nashville. It's a chain. They're unbelievable donuts. They're also very expensive. So if I knew that there was an extra donut in Joe's office, I'd be interested. But if I knew that there were 5 daughters donuts in Woodlawn, I'd be more interested. Because as much as I love me some Krispy Kreme, I love me some 5 daughters way more. But here's the problem. It's way over in Woodlawn. I'm not going to Woodlawn. I live the opposite way. Woodlawn's over there. Over there. I live over there. I'm not going to Woodlawn. I would really love to have me some 5 daughters donuts, but I'm not going that way. Is it worth driving 30 minutes there and 30 minutes back, and then I've got to deal with 101st, and everybody's crazy on 101st? I don't want to deal with that. But if my daughter was dying and the man who could heal her was in Nashville, I'm desperate. If Joe has an extra donut, a 5-hour-old stale Krispy Kreme in his office, I'm a little interested. I'm more interested in 5 daughters donuts, but it's kind of inconvenient. But if my 12-year-old daughter was dying and the man who could heal her was in Nashville, I would run screaming out of this building and go to my truck and start to Nashville. And if my truck didn't start, I would come in, grab Bill by the lapels and say, Bill, you've got to get me to Nashville. And if Bill all of a sudden was uncaring and none of the rest of you would help me, I would run out of here. I would run up to the interstate. I would start tearing down I-24 because my daughter is dying. I'm desperate to get to Nashville to the one who can heal her. Jairus was desperate. And there's a problem for Jairus. There's a crowd. Everybody wants to see Jesus. Everybody wants to talk to Jesus. Everybody wants to interact with Jesus. And I can just picture Jairus with Jesus' robe. Please, please, please hurry. She's very sick. Please hurry. She's very sick. And then this woman in the same crowd. Verse 25, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Which is funny. Do you think Jesus didn't know? This series that we're in right now, this series is called The God Who Sees Me. And literally here in Mark chapter 5, Jesus turns around and can't see the person who touched him. I think he knew who she was. I can't prove it, but I think he knows who she is. Jairus is saying, please, please, come hurry, please. My daughter's sick. Please come hurry. And this woman, she's got her own problems. She doesn't know Jairus and his problems. She reaches out and touches Jesus' robe, and he's healed. And Jesus feels the power go out from him. And he stops and says, "Who touched me?" The Chosen show, the Chosen TV show about Jesus and his disciples, portrays this scene. It's beautiful. If I had 6 minutes to give The Chosen, I'd watch it this morning, but I don't because I want to preach more than I want you to watch The Chosen. But I'm going to share it this afternoon on social media. If you'd like to see it, I'll be happy to send it to you. But I'd love for you to see how The Chosen portrays this scene. But Jesus, he's just walking along. He's being jostled by everybody. He's being pulled and encouraged to come and hurry by Jairus. And he's all bumped, everybody's surrounding him in the crowd. And this woman comes and reaches out and just barely touches the edge of the prayer tassels, the tzitzit of Jesus' robe. And she's immediately healed. And Jesus, in The Chosen, Jesus kind of goes, he feels the power go out of him. He feels the power of healing go out of him. It's kind of a cool scene. And he stops and he says, "Who touched me?" And I think it's Simon Peter. Simon Peter goes, "Duh." He doesn't say that. But he goes, 100 people have touched you. Everybody has touched you. Look around. Everybody's touched you. And he said, "No, I felt healing power go out from me." And he turns around and he looks at the crowd. And by this time, the crowd has parted and this woman is by herself. And he's looking above her head. He doesn't even look down at her. He looks above her head and says, "Who touched me?" Verse 31, you see the people crowding around you. The disciples answered, "And yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. She's the second desperate person in this story. She came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Why? Now, why would she be trembling with fear? Because she's unclean. She is bleeding. She's unclean. Bleeding would mean being separated, and she couldn't come into contact with people. And if she touched somebody, they too became unclean. And if those unclean people touched somebody, they would become unclean. So nobody wants to touch this woman. She came and she fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. And Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." She actually has some really bad theology here. She kind of sees Jesus' robe as being kind of magical. I went to a concert one time when I was a kid, and I ended up with a drumstick from the drummer, and I treated that like it was a holy relic for a long time. It was one of the coolest things I had. Not just is it a drumstick, I didn't play drums, the cool guys played the drums, but it wasn't just a drumstick, it was a drumstick from the drummer of the band that I just watched, and I put lighting around it and, put candles at the corner and everything. No, I didn't do that. But I mean, it was special. She thought, if I can just get close enough to Jesus, I can't touch him because then the rabbi would be unclean. I can't touch him. But if I could just touch the edge of his garment, his robe, if I could just touch his robe, then there's got to be healing in that. And she reaches out and she just barely touches the robe of Jesus, and she's instantly healed. And one of the preachers I listened to this week said it like this: it wasn't her touch that healed her. She thought, if I can just touch, it wasn't her touch that healed her. It was her trust that healed her. It wasn't his robe. It wasn't her action. It was her trust in the person of Jesus. What does Jesus say to her? "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." See, in verse 27, it says she comes to Jesus. And in verse 34, Jesus sends her away. In verse 27, she comes bleeding. In verse 34, she goes away healed. In verse 27, she comes unclean. In verse 34, she goes clean. In verse 27, she comes rejected and outcast. In verse 34, she's welcomed. In verse 27, she's distant. In verse 34, Jesus calls her daughter. There was one more thing. Verse 25, a woman was there who had been the subject of bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. By the way, medicine 2,000 years ago on the other side of the planet was not quite the medicine we have today. So if you went to the doctor and he couldn't help you, maybe the doctor in the next town knew things that this doctor didn't know. And so you'd go to the next town and then you're out of money. So you got to work for another 6 months to save up a little bit of money. He's just scraping out barely enough to live. It's just on the hopes that somebody can heal you. And then you go and you spend all the money on that doctor and it doesn't work. And then you hear that this wise woman, who they would have said in the 9th century was a witch, this wise woman lived out behind that village over there, halfway up the hill, and she lives in a little shack. But some people have said that if you go to her, she can help you. And so she saved her money and said, please, can you help me? Here's my problem. And they made up a little elixir. They made up, something to eat, drink, rub on your body or whatever to be healed. And she wasn't. She had suffered for years, 12 years, and she had tried everything and spent all her money. She was desperate. When she heard about Jesus, verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. And so I wondered, how did she hear about Jesus? Was she just in town that day? I doubt it, because women who were unclean because of blood, they don't get out around big crowds. They would have been called out. They would have the clean, unclean police would have called out on them. Unclean, unclean, and forced you out. It's like leprosy. But somewhere, somebody had told her about Jesus. Somewhere, somebody had said, there's this man who heals blind eyes, who heals lame legs. We've even heard that he can bring people back from the dead. And she thinks, maybe there's hope. Paul in Romans chapter 10 says this, faith comes by hearing. She thought to go to Jesus because she had heard about Jesus. Somebody told her. She heard, she came to Jesus, she touched him, and she was healed. I wonder sometimes, what do people hear from me? Do they just hear how awesome Five Daughters Donuts are? Do they just hear about how as good as Five Daughters Donuts are? You know what's even better? Donut hole donuts in Destin, Florida, with sand between your toes because you've been at the beach all day. Peak summer Dana. When people hear from me, what do they hear? Somebody told this woman about Jesus. And so I wonder, last week I had 2 closes of the message. And so I do again. I'm sorry. Not sorry, but I'm sorry. There's 2 ways to close. How desperate are you today? If I knew that Joe had a stale donut in his office, I'd be interested. If I knew that the man who could heal my dying 12-year-old daughter was in Nashville, you couldn't stop me from getting there. I would be desperate. If I had spent all I had and I had exhausted all my hope because I was broken and bleeding and that separated me from the community, and I heard that there was a Jesus who could heal, you could not stop me from getting to him. Are you that desperate? What are you desperate? Are you desperate for physical healing? Are you desperate for relational healing? Are you desperate for some sort of direction in your life that will give your life meaning and purpose? What are you desperate for? Or You probably have somebody in your life that's desperate. And what do they hear from you? If I have a loved one who knows me but doesn't know Jesus, and they're desperate for something that only Jesus can give, and what they hear from me is donut talk, salvation is not coming. But we can continue to share Jesus with people. We can continue to talk about Jesus, make much of Jesus, tell people of the hope we have in Jesus. So that when Jairus gets desperate and goes to Jesus, when this bleeding woman has come to the end of all of her hope, she went to Jesus because she heard that he was in town and nothing was going to come between them. In just a minute, we're going to come to the table. And I know people get our theology a little bit wonky sometimes, and churches will argue over how we understand the bread and the cup and the body and the blood of Jesus. But I want to paint a picture for you today. In just a moment, you're going to be invited to come up to the table. And like this woman who reached out and touched the robe of Jesus, if you need to come up this morning and put your hands on Jesus, you can. This isn't magic bread. It's from Publix. But it's also more than just a symbol. Joe, in first service, when he baptized the boys this morning, he used the word sacrament. It's a moment where the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of heaven overlap. And God shows up and lives into this moment. When we come to the table, it's a holy moment. And in some way that is beyond my understanding, Jesus shows up and I can put my hands on him and I can receive him into my life. And it might be that you're desperate this morning. You've tried anything and everything else. You're invited to come to the table and receive Jesus today.